When Keir Starmer stood to be Labour leader, he promised to defend free movement as we leave the EU. Now he's whipping Labour MPs to back whatever hard Tory Brexit deal they bring back from Brussels. When Angela Rayner stood to be deputy leader, like Starmer, she pledged to unite the party. Now, this weekend, she pledged to personally suspend thousands of Labour members. What the hell is going on? Ash Sarkar, you're going to be joining me this evening to answer that question. What the hell is going on?
Oh, I thought you brought me on just to talk about the Crown. I've got to talk about Brexit too.
The Crown is going to be the main part of the show. We're going to bookend the show with this question about Labour and Brexit, and then at the end there's going to be the question about Labour and the purge. But the middle section is mainly going to be Tories freaking out over the Crown, which is, Ash is, as I've discovered over the last 24 hours, one of her specialist topics. We've got some other great stories as well. Trump all but conceding the election. The COVID shielders being let down by the government. Very important story there. And a bit more about the run-up to COVID Christmas. Before we go to our first story, you know the score. Share the show link. Tweet on the hashtag #TyskySour with your views about whatever we're talking about today. I mean, I know what we're talking about today. Tweet with your comments on whether or not Starmer is right to whip Labour MPs to back whatever deal the Tories come back with. And your thoughts on the Crown. Do you watch it? Are you thinking, why the hell are they talking about the Crown? Sometimes when we talk about culture, we get a bit of kickback, but I think for other parts of our viewership, they do appreciate it, and this has many a political angle. First story. This was the moment Starmer unilaterally shifted Labour's Brexit policy back in 2018.
It's right that Parliament has the first say. It's right that Parliament has the first say. But if we need to break the impasse, our options must include campaigning for a public vote, and nobody is ruling out Remain as an option. And conference.
So that was the first time Labour had committed to having Remain on the ballot. The leadership had not agreed to that line, so that was Starmer significantly shifting the party in a pro-Remain direction. Then in summer 2019, so the next year, Starmer told Radio 4 that Labour was the party of Remain, saying that the Labour Party would campaign for Remain in any future referendum. Again, not particularly in line with what Jeremy Corbyn was saying at the time. But since then, since becoming leader of the Labour Party instead of Brexit secretary, he's taken a radically different tack. So since he's become leader, he has barely mentioned the Brexit process at all. And, including the deal, we're not expecting him to have become leader and sort of start banging on about a second referendum again, but he hasn't even talked about the deal that's being negotiated. And now, in the latest development, Starmer is apparently planning to whip his MPs to back any deal the Tories come back from Brussels with, come what may, whatever's in it. So this was reported in The Guardian on on Saturday. We can get up this story. So from that write-up, they say, in what he hopes will be a signal to Red Wall voters that the party has heard them, multiple Labour sources said Starmer and Cabinet Office Shadow Minister Rachel Reeves, who has been liaising with backbenchers on the issue, are minded to impose a free-line whip in support of a deal, subject to the detail. They have rejected the idea of abstaining or giving MPs a free vote, fearing it would suggest Labour has failed to absorb the lessons of the pasting it took in last December's general election. The article goes on to report even many of those MPs who fought hard during the 2017-19 Parliament for a people's vote are expected to fall in behind the leadership, fearing the dire consequences of a no-deal exit on the 1st of January. But some MPs say Starmer's team, led by former Darlington MP Jenny Chapman, is too focused on fighting the last war by aiming all their political messaging at disgruntled Brexit voters in the Red Wall. They believe supporting a Johnson deal will leave Labour unable to hold the government to account for Brexit's economic consequences and damage the party in Scotland by allowing Nicola Sturgeon to lump the Westminster parties together on the issue. The SNP will be cock-a-hoop, said one Labour insider. A couple of questions for you here, Ash. Two big things to comment on. Many people, especially on social media, are seeing this as basically as proof that Starmer was behaving opportunistically all the time when he seemed like he was committed to pushing the Labour Party in more of a Remain direction. Was he just manoeuvring? Did he know that wouldn't be popular with the public and now he's actually Labour leader? He's taking a much more realistic approach. Or is this just him, changing with the shifting times? The argument has been, one, it was won in the 2019 general election by the Brexiteers and the Conservatives, and he is just getting with the times. The second question is this a sensible position from the Labour Party? Are they right to say no deal would be so bad that whatever deal you come back with, basically, we will vote for it, and not only will we vote for it, we'll whip all of our MPs to do the same?
I mean, as for whether Keir Starmer is being opportunistic, yes, he is. He's a very canny political operator, even if I don't agree with a lot of his politics, even if I don't agree with the approach he's taking to party management, where I do think he's actually strategized himself into a cul-de-sac, but that's another thing. I think that he's always had a very clear idea of what it is that he wanted to do, and that was become the leader of the Labour Party and then become Prime Minister. He achieved the first by making a pitch to the membership on two fronts. The first was, you need somebody to shift this party towards a more unambiguously Remain position, and I'll be the guy to do that for you. And then the second, after the 2019 election results, was you need somebody who will deliver Corbynite economic policy with a veneer of competence and not going to spook older voters. He made both those pitches to the membership very, very successfully. The first, because there was a overwhelming amount of support for Remain within the membership, something which was quite dearly felt. And there was also a sense of what was going on outside the party, the People's Vote marches, Labour's, mortal wounding from the defection of the Chook Tinge MPs. That pressure mounted. Keir Starmer capitalised on that and very smartly. But that's not a route to becoming Prime Minister. It simply isn't. Having a second referendum, overturning the referendum result even with minoritarian positions. And I think lots of people, myself included, very much including myself in this, the noise of the People's Vote lot became disorientating. It really did. And you also saw a leadership really struggling to make the case for a soft Brexit from the get-go. And there was the sense of the coalition falls apart one way or another. What's going to be the least damaging? Oh, it'll be going for a second referendum. We don't have the counterfactual for what would have happened without that. I don't think it would have delivered an election win either. So Keir Starmer made that pitch to the membership. He's now making a pivot towards the country. And what he knows is that the country don't actually give a shit about whether we're in a customs union, not in a customs union, what kind of trade arrangements do we have or not, as long as we're out. And that Labour have to be seen not to obstruct that in any way, even if that means forsaking its own due diligence over the contents of the deal. And that is, I think, strategically a smart move. It might have damaging long-term consequences. What happens if you sacrifice your political credibility by voting unambiguously in favour of something which might have certain repercussions economically later down the line? That's a risk that Keir Starmer is taking. But not reopening those wounds and reopening that Brexit culture war is smart decision-making. It's opportunistic decision-making, it's calculated decision-making, but it's smart decision-making all the same.
No, I mean, I agree with that, basically. I do think that this does seem like the smart decision. I don't really know whether you whip or whether you give a free vote, whatever. I'm not that fussed, but I think not kicking up a fuss over what is in the deal at this point in time, I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. I think what this really shows, actually, for me, so it's partly about Starmer, which is that, yes, he did push the Labour Party in a Remain direction. He wasn't necessarily the leading force, but he was one of the most consequential forces who took the Labour Party in that particular direction. He wasn't alone. There's no point in saying it was all down to him. But the big difference for me between Keir Starmer's leadership on this question and Jeremy Corbyn's leadership on this question is that Keir Starmer has been totally free to take whatever position he thinks is most electorally advantageous. And so I haven't really heard him make a principled argument as to his strategy of not talking about the deal. Obviously, what deal the Conservatives come back with is going to be very consequential for the future of Britain for decades, depending on what are the particular features of the deal they agree. So there isn't really a principled argument to not be holding the government to account for it, but there's a very strong electoral one which is to say people are bored of the Labour Party banging on about Brexit, and also the seats that they desperately need to win back are ones that won't really appreciate the Labour Party banging on about Brexit. But that was a privilege that was never offered to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was never able to say, I have control over the direction of the Labour Party, and I'm going to make a decision, which is that we are going to sidestep this issue as much as we can. We're going to try and take the heat out of it. And we're going to sort of play a tactical game, which isn't necessarily the most principled one. I think, Labour under Corbyn were fairly opportunistic when it came to the Brexit vote. But he was unable to do that. The moment he tried to do something that was electorally sensible, but not necessarily the most principled position to take on Brexit, he had hundreds and hundreds of backbench MPs out on television, screaming at him, shouting at him, saying, how dare he let down Labour's base like this? And the argument that's being made by these backbench MPs is the reason they're not doing this now is because the debate has been concluded. And the reason I don't find that very convincing is because the debate on whether or not Brexit should happen, which was the debate they were having last year, that was concluded in 2016. So all of these MPs who agitated from 2017 onwards to reopen that debate, they weren't particularly persuaded by the argument that a debate was over, so we should move on. And now, yes, the debate on whether or not Brexit should happen is even more over than it was in 2019. But the debate about what kind of Brexit we should have, what kind of deal we should have, is very much open. The only argument for not having that argument is an electoral one, which is perfectly legitimate. But that was not leeway, that was not sort of room for manoeuvre that any of them were willing to grant to Jeremy Corbyn. And so the fact that Keir Starmer can take a sensible Brexit position, which I think is what he is doing now, is because there aren't hundreds of MPs behind him who are desperate to use any opportunity to undermine his leadership. So I don't necessarily think we should say, Keir Starmer, what you should be doing is holding by your pledges and saying, I won't vote for any deal if it doesn't give free movement, because I think that would be a disastrous policy. But I do think we have to recognise that the reason why Jeremy Corbyn wasn't able, why it wasn't possible for him to take such a sensible Brexit position, was because there are many MPs who are now constantly cheering for Keir Starmer's position, who, if Jeremy Corbyn was saying something similar, would have been, they'd be mounting a coup. They'd have, forks up ready to attack the guy in the street. Ash, your final thoughts on this. Where do you think it's going to go next? I thought the point from that article, which was kind of interesting, is will this really damage Labour in Scotland? The idea there being that everyone in England is really bored of this debate, but you've still got Nicola Sturgeon talking about Brexit. She talked about it in her speech to conference today. So the idea is this may still be a live issue in Scotland because there are people with an interest in keeping it as a live interest, keeping it as a live interest, as a live debate, whereas there aren't in this side of the border. So do you think this could damage them in Scotland?
I mean, look, Scotland, London, Manchester, Birmingham, all got the same problem. And that problem is that they're held hostage, essentially, by the polity of England, right? That's an issue. There is not an expression of a political sentiment which is pushing for either more devolved powers or indeed, full autonomy from that polity in any of those cities. But there is one in Scotland. And what Nicola Sturgeon is very good at identifying is marshalling absolutely every single frustration with that hostage situation into the demand for a second Scottish independence referendum. And for as long as she is able to do that, for as long as she's able to marshal those frustrations into the demand of a rerun, that's terrible for Labour in Scotland. They don't have a way back in. Nicola Sturgeon has got the electoral coalition of their dreams of, formerly industrialised, working class, non-urban to, educated graduates, city dwelling, that's exactly the one Labour want. That's exactly the one that they can't find a way into because they don't have an electoral expression of like, we also really fucking hate Westminster. We hate being here too. And who that ends up being best for, all in all, the Conservative Party. For as long as Boris Johnson looks over and sees SNP MPs staring back at him in the House of Commons, he knows that Labour don't have a path towards a majority. So yes, there are huge downsides to this for Labour in Scotland, There are upsides for Labour potentially within the red wall, although I do think that this idea of, how many of those voters are really going to come back, I think people are being a bit optimistic here. But ultimately, it's a win-win for Boris Johnson. Keir Starmer really is in a bind, a similar bind in terms of, where do you put your emphasis in terms of preserving your coalition as Jeremy Corbyn, except it's not going to be nearly so wounding, nearly so delegitimizing, because he's not got his own backbenchers trying to kick him in the head.
Yeah, that's the key point, isn't it? It's much easier to be a party leader when you don't have your own backbenchers kicking you in the head in collusion with the media. We are going to go back to the Labour Party for our final story, talking about the purges which were threatened over the weekend by Angela Rayner, and a bunch of other sort of quotes that came out of the JLM LFI conference on the weekend. We have almost 2,000 people watching. Let's get as many people in here tonight, so do share the show link. Keep your tweets and your comments coming. Tory frontbenchers are still battling over whether or not Scotch eggs are substantial enough to justify a pint in English pubs. But epidemiologists are most concerned about the 5-day free-for-all being promised for us all over Christmas. Piers Morgan pushed Environment Secretary George Eustice on his Christmas plans on today's Good Morning Britain.
To do that by allowing millions of people to congregate in large numbers inside in exactly the way that you have concluded as a government is most dangerous. This is why you've shut pubs and restaurants. I don't get it.
By limiting it to bubbles of 3 households.
3 households? That could be up to 25, 30 people in some families.
Well, no, it probably won't in real life. In reality, this will be 3 households, and you'll be talking about families able to come together just for that.
Are you going to
period.
Be with your family? Have you worked out what to do at Christmas yet?
Yes, I shall probably be having my mother and father-in-law over to our place at Christmas, so we'll have probably.
And you won't be able to have a dinner with them in a restaurant.
That's right. I wouldn't.
Why?
If
I'm a restaurant
London.
owner, I'm like, well, hang on, Mr. Eustace, why can't you have dinner or lunch with your in-laws in a restaurant, but you can do it for 5 days, lunch and dinner, over the Christmas period? What's the difference in terms of public health?
Well, because we're trying to strike a balance here, and doing this over Christmas, people want to be able to come together at Christmas. It's been a difficult time. We want to be able to provide for that. And as I said, these are emergency measures that we're doing to dampen the spread of the virus. Of course, I can understand restaurants would say that, but then enabling them to open for a few days, 3 or 4 days, probably wouldn't cut it for them either.
I have to say, that was kind of a stupid line of questioning from Piers Morgan, or at least I don't know why George Eustice didn't come up with the obvious answer, because the reason why having your parents-in-law over to have Christmas dinner at your house is different from a restaurant is because in a restaurant there will be many other households. So it's an airborne virus. What you don't want to be doing is sitting in enclosed spaces with lots of people. The more people, the worse. If you're in a restaurant with 30 people, that's 3 times as bad as being in a house with 10 people. It's not rocket science. What I thought was interesting there, though, is the way George Eustice just said, sort of matter-of-factly, that his parents-in-law will be coming over for Christmas. And why I thought that was not necessarily surprising that that's happening, but surprising that he said it in such a sort of matter-of-fact, there's no complications here, is that if you look at the age of George Eustice, they're presumably quite old. You'd imagine his parents-in-law are probably in their 70s, potentially in their 80s. And so you would have thought that if you were trying to provide leadership to a country who is still in the middle of a pandemic, the vaccine is not rolled out yet, it won't be rolled out by Christmas, then either you would say, look, we as a government have decided that because people will want to, or some people will want to hang out with their families at Christmas, we've decided we're not going to criminalise that, we're going to allow it, but we are going to take the lead personally and have those conversations on Zoom because we realise a vaccine is around the corner. I think that would probably be the best option. The other option, though, would be if he is going to have his parents-in-law round, who are presumably in their 70s or 80s, then to at least explain that you are going to, or that he is going to, take all of the precautionary measures which are going to be necessary to keep the older generations in this country alive. So, yes, I will keep them over, but what I'm going to make sure I do is it's not going to be a normal Christmas. We're going to have the windows open. I'm going to make sure that we all have different plates. This should be an opportunity, really, a teachable moment where cabinet ministers can go out on the TV and say, I will set an example here. This can't be a normal Christmas because, as epidemiologists, as SAGE members are telling us, if we treat this as a normal Christmas, lots of people are going to die, and they're going to die because they caught a disease a month before they were able to get immunized against it. So it does all seem pretty odd to me that the government aren't sort of laying the groundwork here for people to have a more sensible Christmas than at the moment, they're being actively encouraged basically to let go of all your inhibitions over that 5 days, and we'll deal with the consequences afterwards. It seems wholly irresponsible and also really unnecessary. On this question, there was a great piece in The Guardian by SAGE member Stephen Riker on what else the government could be doing to make Christmas safer. So he is sort of saying, the decision has been made. There will be 5 days over Christmas where restrictions are loosened. He's saying, I'm not going to argue with that. That's done. We can't overturn that. But there are many things the government could be doing to make sure that this is safer than it otherwise would be. I'm going to read a few of his suggestions, which I think are such no-brainers that it's one of those ones where it's like, why are they not doing this? So he writes, of course, the best way to stay safe over Christmas is to avoid indoor mixing altogether. We could decide to avoid meeting up at all, employing our newfound skills with Zoom and other digital platforms, and instead plan extravagant reunions for 2021. To make this possible, the government could declare extra public holidays for next year, for instance, in the spring and summer. He goes on to talk about measures that can be taken to reduce risks if you do have your parents or older relatives over for Christmas. So he writes, a clear, focused information campaign would help us mitigate risks even when mixing indoors. And the government can help us in other ways besides. It could allow school lessons to be taught online a week before the end of term, adding these days later in the academic calendar once a vaccine becomes available. This would help families to isolate prior to Christmas reunions. Now, that makes so much sense. He's saying, look, if you're going to meet up with your older parents, then if you can, you should avoid meeting people in the previous 2 weeks because you want to be as sure as possible that you don't have coronavirus. He's also saying that, our older populations or vulnerable populations would be so much safer if we just had a 2-week circuit breaker, including schools, before Christmas. Then you probably could go hug your grandma. Because if you haven't hung out in what at the moment are, as we know from SAGE, the key vectors for virus transmission, which is secondary schools, if no one has been in a secondary school for the previous 2 weeks, then older people are going to be much safer. He had some more sort of things that I hadn't thought of that I thought were really good ideas as well that the government is not talking about. Also, the opposition is not talking about, by the way. He's saying that if you were telling people to have their windows open in midwinter, they're going to think, come on, mate, are you joking? This is like putting money straight out of the window, essentially, because you've got to have your heating on really high. He's saying, why not give people an extra winter fuel allowance to say, look, we're going to give you this cash specifically for your gas bill, and we can all, have a Christmas where we have our windows open, and we obviously don't care about the environment for those 5 days because the costs are much greater in the short term. And the government isn't doing any of this. And I do find it really strange that every time they go on the television, all they can do is justify the decision they've made. They've said, no, it's not that big a risk. We've made this decision because it can be safe. What they should say is this was a difficult decision to make. It's not going to be safe, frankly, but there are these ways that we can make it as safe as possible. And they're just not bothering to do that. And it seems to me that we will have many people who die in January who didn't need to, who would have got vaccinated 2 weeks after they actually caught the illness, from especially their grandchildren who, unless plans change, will have been in secondary schools only 7 days before Christmas Day. Ash, I want to get your thoughts on this. It's sort of, it's kind of the unimaginativeness of the government, or I suppose their disinterest in putting forward any kind of public health messaging and sort of saying, look, we're all in this together. Let's try and make Christmas as safe as possible. All they can do is go out on television in a very defensive way and say, look, no, we made the right decision. We made the right decision. It's safe. Stop asking me difficult questions. It's going to be fine, which to me is not leadership.
Well, look, the government's decided, and I think they're actually correct in this assessment, that they've got latitude here to essentially kill a bunch of people in order to have a Christmas which feels quote unquote normal. That's what they've got the latitude for. Like, I've been, keeping abreast of, Vox Pops, and I've been also conducting some of my own older family members. There is an alarming sense of, well, if I die, what's a life like this anyway? There's a real sort of like casualness about it. And I think it's because the manner of the dying, the loneliness of it, the scariness of it, the pain of it hasn't trickled through for people still after all this time. So you do have a lot of older people who, because they have made their peace with generally getting older and what that means in terms of mortality, taking in some ways quite a casual attitude to all this. And so when you go, actually, it's not an either or, it's not do we do Christmas at all, but it's the manner in which we do it. It's, all these things that we could take, which are reasonable precautions. If there was government advice to, essentially have a circuit breaker in the 2 weeks before, so that you can make sure that you don't have it before you pass it on, or even rolling out enough testing nationally so you could have 2 negative tests before you make the decision to form multi-household bubbles. These would all be ways of doing it safer. But because we've had a really absurd national conversation since the beginning of this pandemic for us, since March, where the binary is between lockdown, don't see each other, or do absolutely nothing, let the virus continue unchecked in the interest of the university sector, or getting back in the offices, or having a Christmas dinner. We don't have a political culture which is taking these ideas particularly seriously, and I think it's a real shame. It's going to cost lives, because I do obviously see the appeal and desire to have a family Christmas, and it's not just a religious thing. I know that there are some people, particularly from communities of color, who feel like, well, we had Eid cancelled, so why is Christmas getting special treatment? It's not necessarily because of the religious significance of it. I mean, people celebrated Easter at home. It's because it's a nationwide byword for time with your family. It is, a secular event as well as it's a religious one. I think for most people up and down the country, it's somewhat secular. So I can really see the appeal and the desire, and people going, I'll take this risk. But the thing is that they don't have to, or they don't have to take nearly as much risk if you had a media class which was doing its job and making sure that the government was doing their job.
I mean, it's exactly the same as, the government want us to be having a binary debate between people who want to cancel Christmas and people who want to give you Christmas, or a binary debate between kids shouldn't have any education and schools should be open as normal. And in all of these questions, there is a midway. Yeah, maybe schools should be open, but maybe we should fit them out so that they have much greater ventilation than they already have, instead of essentially, I think, as the government did, mislead people to say they were safer than they were. So there is just a great deal of honesty lacking from this government's response, and also imagination. We're going to go on to our next story in a moment, which is about a certain Netflix series. First of all, Dan Warrington with a £5. Here's a present to celebrate my birthday. Happy birthday, Dan Warrington. Ash and Michael, you were both legends. Thank you so much. Thanks for keeping me sane for another year. Thank you to you and everyone else in the Tysky Sour audience who keeps us all sane and has kept us all sane this year. We do have a few more birthdays. I'm going to save them till the end, because I do love them, but they come thick and fast now, so they're going to start going at the end of the show, as a sort of habit. Great. Also, tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky Sour. The British government have a lot on their plate right now. We have to get to the other side of winter, with COVID still raging through the population while avoiding the same level of deaths we saw in spring. We are now only a month away from the end of the transition period. We will be leaving the EU, deal or no deal, on the 31st of December. But Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden has still found time to focus on the issues that really matter. Yes, I'm talking about whether or not Netflix series The Crown has misrepresented Prince Charles and the Queen. This story relates to comments he made on Saturday when speaking to the Daily Mail, and this particular article from the Mail on the Mail on Sunday it's a brilliant article just because it's very entertaining. So we're going to go through most of it, in fact. So they write, Oliver Dowden last night demanded that Netflix make clear The Crown is fiction. In a dramatic intervention, the Culture Secretary added his voice to mounting concern that fabricated scenes in the drama series were so damaging to the royal family that viewers should be warned at the start of each episode that it was not fact. He says, "It's a beautifully produced work of fiction. So as with other TV productions, Netflix should be very clear at the beginning it is just that," he told the Mail on Sunday. "Without this, I fear a generation of viewers who did not live through these events may mistake fiction for fact." There was also pushback from allies of Prince Charles. So this is that section. They say, "It comes amid deepening concern that fabricated scenes written by screenwriter Peter Morgan are doing lasting damage to the monarchy and Prince Charles in particular. Last night, a friend of the Prince said, it is quite sinister the way that Morgan is clearly using light entertainment to drive a very overt Republican agenda, and people just don't see it. They have been lured in over the first few series until they can see how they are being manipulated." I quite like that sort of conspiracy theory there from someone close to Prince Charles, which, I mean, he's kind of suggesting that the first 3 series of The Crown were so good and agreeable just so in series 4 they could try and corrupt your opinion of Prince Charles. I imagine many of our viewers watch The Crown. I'm currently halfway through series 4. I know Ash has watched the whole thing. We can get some pictures up now, in case you haven't. You can see their physical likeness. This is Prince Charles. He is portrayed very negatively on the whole in the series, basically being shown as very egotistical, fairly disinterested in Princess Diana's well-being. He is much more physically attractive in the program than he is in real life, but I suppose that hasn't made it up for him and his allies. This is Princess Diana in the film, or in the show, whose sort of physical likability or physical likeness to Princess Diana is quite remarkable. She comes across as quite charming, which I suppose is to be imagined or to be expected. Ash, I want to go to you on this because I know we both watched The Crown, but I feel like you have more expert knowledge than I do. Do you think it has been unfair to Prince Charles? And do you think that Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary, is right to take some time out in the middle of a pandemic? And you might say, yeah, he's culture secretary, he doesn't care about public health anyway. We do have an industry in crisis in this country because of lockdown and pandemic, so he should be doing other things. But yeah, let's go to that basic question. Is The Crown unfair to Prince Charles?
I mean, look, before we get into it, can I just ask, can I be Novara's official royal correspondent? Because we don't have one. And I think it should be me.
I think we should probably advertise that openly, Ash. We don't do jobs for friends in this organisation. You're gonna have to compete fair and square for the highly respected position of royal correspondent for Novara Media.
When's nepotism?
But anyway, do your audition now. Treat this as your audition.
Okay. All right. Well, first, you've got look, this whole discussion is completely ridiculous because obviously it's fiction. And I don't remember the brouhaha around Peter Morgan's film The Queen, starring, of course, Helen Mirren as the titular queen, when it was depicting the days immediately following Princess Diana's death. And it was depicting the queen as essentially emotionally overwhelmed by a situation which was completely at odds with what she'd been taught were the values of stoicism and duty and so on and so forth. There was actually positive noises coming out of Clarence House at that point. And it's the same guy making this series, and suddenly they've turned against him. They say he's a closet Republican, all of this. The reason why, and it's very simple, is because this one season has completely undone the decades worth of PR put in by the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall, Charles and Camilla, because the people who lived through the Prince of Wales's divorce, there were very clear binary goodies and baddies, and partly that was because Princess Diana was a very adept player of the press. She did the Martin Bashir interview. She gave an interview to Andrew Morton, which became the documentary film In Her Own Words. And she spilt the tea. And then you also had the notorious tampon gate. Do you know about tampon gate, Michael?
Was when Prince Charles, there was sort of a love letter revealed from him to Camilla where he said he wanted to be her tampon, sort of because he wanted to be inside. I'm getting that right, aren't I?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, basically, they were having a phone call. Is that your like your sex chat? You're like, I want to be a sanitary product for you.
I want to be your anal depository. Sorry, that's distracting.
I never thought you'd ask. God. But look, so this was like a phone conversation between Charles and Camilla where he actually didn't mean it in a sexy way. He was kind of being self-effacing and weirdly jokey, and he was saying, "Oh, just my luck. I'd come back to Earth as your tampon, and be reincarnated as your tampon, and spend my days swirling around the U-bend." So it was actually a bit more self-aware and jokey than that. But there was pretty clear goodies and baddies. Even though Diana's infidelities became public knowledge, Charles and Camilla were seen as you broke up the fairy tale couple. You, Camilla, you're a Scarlet Woman. You'd been carrying on with him when you were married yourself and all of this. And in the years since Diana's death, they really carefully built up a public image which had moved away from that story quite significantly. And the reason why this is important, the reason why it's important to Buckingham Palace that the Crown is sort of undone this decade's worth of PR is because when Charles becomes king, they don't know what they're going to do with Camilla, right? So she's divorced, right? And marrying a divorced woman, that's what caused the abdication way back in the 1930s. They've sorted that bit out and they'll go, okay, all right, so you're going to be married to a king, but unlike literally every other consort in history, apart from the male consorts of a queen, you're not going to be a queen consort. You might be a princess consort or something like that. They were going to try and work around it to avoid the sticky divorce issue and avoid riling up the public too much. Now with these record-breaking numbers of people watching The Crown, that's out the window. People are back in that sort of 1990s soap opera of Charles and Camilla bad. Now, as to whether, Peter Morgan was fair in that depiction or not, you can see what he's used as his source material, particularly for the accounts of Princess Diana's eating disorder, Charles's responses to that. You can see how he's really relied on, the Andrew Morton book and other sources, which have shown events very much from her point of view. There was a war of briefing between the two of them, but Princess Diana was always able to win because she was the only one willing to put her face, her name, her voice to the account, whereas other members of the royal family, very famously, would never ever do that. So I think that that's why the story is told in the way that it is. I think another reason why the story is told in the way that it is, which is a lot less, the previous seasons of The Crown, I'm not sure if you watched all of them, it presented Queen Elizabeth as essentially, a good person who it struggles to do nothing, but doing nothing is all she can do. And she's got a kind of stuffy sense of duty, but essentially she's all right. In this season where you've got the kind of speeding train of historical fiction colliding with our moral values as it gets closer to the present day, you start to see the royal family as being not just, outdated and not just having values which are incompatible with the modern world, but are actively cruel, cold, destroying of people, their sensibilities and their inner lives. And that's because there's no way around the fact that, well, yes, that's the case. You've got people whose lives are completely ruined because they're being shoved into these mismatched marriages. Why? To maintain a system of unearned wealth and power, which stretches back to William the Conqueror. It's basically your ancestor was the most successful thug of his day, and now you get to be head of state. So it inevitably becomes a less charitable depiction, because you see how weird the social norms are within that family, which maintain that fundamentally anti-democratic settlement. So I'm not surprised that Conservatives are annoyed about it, but that's what has to happen if you want to have a drama depicting any of these people without simply becoming a kind of, Sophia Coppola, Marie Antoinette, where you become so enraptured by the glamour and the baroque and the gilding that you don't actually tell a social or a historical story anymore. So I think it's the constraints of the form, and I think it's a really good series.
What? That was very abrupt. I peeked into the comments as you were speaking there. I think your audition as royal correspondent has gone down very well. My royal inspired chat up line slightly less so. I should have said suppository, not depository. Although I did Google anal depository, which is something which is not what I'm referring to. The other person in the show, or their depiction that has been pissing people off, is Maggie Thatcher. We can get up an image of Maggie Thatcher there. She's very entertaining in the show. I want to go back to a tweet which was tweeted by Tim Montgomery, who's worked in Downing Street recently. He was also a writer at Conservative Home, but he was one of Boris Johnson's advisors. So he tweets out, "I can't bear to watch any more of The Crown and its absurd, hateful portrayal of Margaret Thatcher. Such a shame." I was confused when I watched the first 2 episodes and saw that tweet, because in the first 2 episodes she comes off really well, because she's someone who's sort of against hereditary privilege. She goes to meet the royals at Balmoral, and she sort of thinks that they're all kind of stuck-up elitists, and she's a hard-working person who has worked for her success. But when you do go later in the show, she does obviously get portrayed in a more negative light. Some of it's true, though. I was watching the Maggie Thatcher documentary on the weekend, actually, because one of the things that happens in the show is they say she didn't really like her daughter, or didn't like her daughter to the same extent as her son. And in this documentary, it's another BBC documentary, very good. One of her private secretaries tells this anecdote of he went in to meet Maggie Thatcher to discuss whatever, and he heard a little scuttling in a cupboard. And so he says, "Maggie, what's going on? Have you got rats in your cupboard?" And she was like, "Oh no, that's my daughter. She was wearing jeans." So because her daughter was wearing jeans, she put her in the cupboard. So, obviously at Novara Media, we disagree with this woman's politics, but she also seemed like a pretty goddamn strange individual. My absolute favourite bit, though, of the Mail article is a comment from a Tory peer. So we can get this up. It says, in a letter to Mr. Dowden, Tory peer Lord Forsyth, who describes the latest series of The Crown as one step up from Spitting Image, expressed surprise that Netflix pays no corporation tax, as the 1 billion of UK subscriptions are paid to a Dutch company. So this is the only way you can get Tories to care about tax evasion, is get a tax-avoiding company to speak badly of Prince Charles. We need, I suppose, Amazon and Apple and all of these other mega corporations to start a little battle with the royals to make any progress on that front. A couple of comments before we go on to our next section. FCJ14 with a fiver. Novara transfer tattoos, please. I want a Tysky sour tat on my neck for Christmas dinner. That's a good idea. We have just got a new merch officer, so there is going to be some merch coming up very soon. But I'm hoping we can do it in time for Christmas, but we'll have to see. It's very much out of my control. Let's go on to our next story. Before we do that, you know the score. Novara Media Tysky Sour is only possible because of your support. If you haven't already, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Donald Trump and his ragtag band of campaign lawyers have spent the last few weeks trying every trick in the book to avoid the reality that Biden defeated him in this month's presidential election. His team have mounted legal challenges in multiple states, often on pretext so flimsy that judges that even Trump appointed laughs them out of court. In Wisconsin, though, a challenge was not dependent on court victory, as state law dictates that if the margin of victory is less than 1%, the losing side can request a recount, so long as they pay for the privilege. They have to pay for the privilege if it's within 1%. If it's within 0.25%, the state pays, but it wasn't within 0.25%. So Trump put up that cash, and we have the results back. So after recounting over 3 million ballots, thousands of which Trump had claimed were fraudulent, the new results are in, and it turns out Biden gained 87 votes. So after a recount which cost Donald Trump $3 million, all that has been discovered is that Biden did ever so slightly better than we already believed. There is also, it sounds like the whole process is obviously farcical. If you've seen any of the images of Rudy Giuliani with the sort of hair dye coming down his face, you'll know that anything that has happened over the past 3 weeks in American politics is nothing if not entertaining. But we can also get up this story about Trump observers who are sort of taking part in the recount that Trump paid $3 million to take place, were obstructing that very recount. It's ridiculous. It's very entertaining seeing this sort of as the final bowing out of a president who thought so highly of themselves. There is also a serious point here, though, which I want to get your thoughts on, Ash, which is that, you know, in the wake of the election, there were many people sort of saying, Donald Trump, yes, he's lost the election, but he is, you know, he's a crypto-fascist. He is going to undermine the fabric of American democracy. He's potentially going to stay on in the White House, provoking some sort of, I mean, civil war is probably going a bit far, but, you know, people thought that would be something, you know, something that we hadn't seen before, in over a century in the United States. And what has in fact happened is he's done some press conferences which have been almost universally panned. Everyone said, this guy is ridiculous. He's ultimately said in the past week that if Biden wins in the Electoral College, he will leave peacefully. And does the sort of ridiculous nature of Trump's behavior in the 3 weeks since the election sort of show that these fears from American liberals and liberals over here was always a little bit hysterical and overstated? Or is the fact that Donald Trump is now sort of conceding signs that actually it's not that those fears were unfounded, but just that the liberals have won?
I think it's a little of column A and a little of column B. I think the fears of stochastic terrorism, which is acts of violence committed by people who are inspired by the rhetoric and ideology of Donald Trump, but aren't directly ordered to do something. It's not like an organized terrorist cell structure, are relatively well founded. One, because you've seen it happen, of course, in the horrific violence meted out to Black Lives Matter and anti-fascist protesters. Kyle Rittenhouse, who's been welcomed and celebrated amongst sections of the Republican Party after allegedly killing 2 people in Wisconsin. You've also got Donald Trump's history in terms of, you know, when there were neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, calling them very fine people. And that was, again, a deadly conflict. Heather Heyer, a counter-protester, was murdered by a Unite the Right supporter who mowed her down with his car. So those were relatively well-founded fears in terms of, is something really bad going to happen, and will it be because Donald Trump has explicitly encouraged it? I think what happened was that Trump missed his moment. I think that he saw some very tight electoral races, just like all of us did. The results come in very slowly for an American election. They tend to decide other people's elections a lot quicker than they decide their own. And I think missed his opportunity. So ended up kind of impotently bleating about stop the count. You had some demonstrations, but nothing to really, really worry about. And then you had these legal proceedings, which just sucked the energy and the momentum out of it. So I think that window of opportunity, if it ever existed, closed. I do think that it is telling that this is a particular president whose arbitrariness and impulsivity means that people are seriously considering this as an option. And I think it also says something about, you know, the opacity around certain aspects of the American democratic process, of what happens when the usual norms no longer apply. We did not find out this time because it was a decision that Donald Trump made not to pursue certain courses of action. But I think those weaknesses and those questions remain, particularly because Trumpism as a coherent set of interests within the Republican Party of, you know, white nationalism plus, you know, a kind of nihilism, you know, reckless abandonment of you know, global climate agreements, that is something that's going to stay in the Republican Party. So I think that, yes, there was probably a bit of hysteria, especially with some of those fantasies about, you know, Joe Biden and General Petraeus both frog marching Trump out of the White House. But those fears came from somewhere. I don't think it was all hysteria.
I think that's a very balanced, fair assessment, Ash. I think it would be very hard for anyone to disagree with you there, which is, I mean, I agree with you there. We've got a super chat from Jeb Supertramp, a $5, thank you very much. Abolish the monarchy, cut off their heads immediately, vive la République. I agree with abolish the monarchy. I don't think you need to cut off their heads. I mean, I can see why in the 17th century, maybe you would have to cut off the heads of the royals because that's the only way to stop a threat of counter-revolution. Otherwise, they will be waiting in the wings, ready to mount an army and overthrow you. But now I think if we manage to, get a referendum to abolish the monarchy, you could do it fairly, well, absolutely in a bloodless way. So especially as I'm live on YouTube, I'm not going to endorse beheading anyway, but I also don't think there's any strategic necessity of doing it in this particular political context. Right, let's go to our next story. Before we do that, if you are new to this show, even if you aren't, but you just haven't done it yet, please do hit the subscribe button. And we recently went over 100k subscribers, and we did a special Ask Me Anything show on YouTube last night with Dahlia, me, Ash, and Aaron. It was great fun. It's still available for your viewing, so do check it out. And we'll try and mark these landmarks, or mark these events with more content for you. The coronavirus pandemic has raised a number of policy conundrums which are painfully difficult to resolve. For example, whether we should prioritise school openings or virus suppression is a genuine dilemma, as is the length and severity of lockdowns. One thing we should all have been able to agree on, though, is that people with clinical vulnerabilities to coronavirus should have been given generous support, both financial and social, material, practical. And on that, the government, and I'd argue our entire political class, has dramatically failed. So in the first lockdown, people who needed to shield weren't offered proper financial support. They could ask their bosses to furlough them, but if their bosses said no, that was the end of the story. There was no official recourse to say, look, we're shielding. We 100% should not be forced to go back into work or rely on universal credit. In this second wave, it's even worse. Because not only is there not sufficient financial support for people who are shielding, there seems to be no support whatsoever. Now, I think this is very much an under-discussed topic in British political discourse, which is why I'm delighted that Novara published a great piece on this issue today. It's by health and social care policy consultant Jamie Hale. Really do recommend going to give that a read on the extent to which shielders have been abandoned during especially this lockdown. I spoke earlier to Jamie today about the challenges facing people shielding this winter.
When I was shielding in the first lockdown, there was a considerable amount of support offered. So, as well as the priority supermarket slots, which they originally were going to end just before the second lockdown, but then thankfully decided to continue, we were sent food parcels by local government organisations, and also I received regular calls from the team that fund my care package to make sure that I had people in round the clock and that I had contingency plans in place for anyone to develop COVID. With this second lockdown, there have been no food parcels to people who might need them, and there's been very limited support in terms of phone calls, contact, advice, etc. So we're being asked very much to obey the same restrictions, but with far less formal support in place. And I've really felt that there's also been far less informal support offered as well. In terms of shielding, it's always felt like the government don't really understand what they're asking of people. So people have been expected to continue sending their children to school, and for people they live with them to continue going to work, even in very high-risk professions, with the person shielding advised to keep 2 meters distance while in the house, stay near open windows, and ensure that things like bathrooms are cleaned before use. Trying to live like that for months on end is entirely impractical, especially when, for example, you're a parent who's been told that you have to send your children to school or you'll be threatened with fines or prison. When we were thinking about this, I spoke to a friend of mine called Fee Anderson, who's got 2 young daughters, and who said that she ultimately decided to send her children to school, despite, like me, having a condition that required part-time ventilation, a machine to help with breathing, because she was terrified of the fines and, I suppose, the potential threat of prison were she not to send her children to school. But of course, this has been terrifying for her and her partner, because they can see that the school just isn't able to obey the COVID restrictions that are being put on it. So they are just left hoping that there isn't an outbreak in their children's school.
That was Jamie Hale, and you can check out their article on the novaramedia.com website, or the Novara Media website, which is at novaramedia.com. Yesterday was the joint conference between the Jewish Labour Movement and Labour Friends of Israel in the wake of the IHRA report into Labour and anti-Semitism and the suspension of the whip from Corbyn. This was closely watched, especially as big names, including Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, were in attendance. It was Rayner who got the biggest headline from the day, stating that, and I quote, "If I have to suspend thousands and thousands of members, we will do that." And we can get some of her, or we can get the fuller quote up here. So she says, "If I have to suspend thousands of members, we will do that, because we cannot and we will not accept an injury to one, because an injury to one is an injury to all. That's what we say in our movement." She goes on, "It's about education as well. It's about having this approach where we don't accept that people, we have debates, but there's no debating what the IHRA said. There's no debating whether anti-Semitism exists in the Labour Party. It does, and we've got to do everything we can to stamp it out." Now, there's a number of problems with this. First of all, if you're the deputy leader of the Labour Party, I think standing up and saying, "I will suspend thousands of members if I need to," is not quite the right approach. One, the IHRA has specifically said that you need to depoliticize these issues. So if she's suggesting that she personally is going to suspend thousands of people, I think that would probably fall foul of the recommendations from the report from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. More than that, though, it has the features of so much of this debate, which is to make their point stronger. Labour politicians essentially have to completely twist what Labour members are actually doing. So Angela Rayner there is saying we can't debate what the IHRA said. Now, for one, I think people can. I think this idea that a report gets released and suddenly it's a taboo to even question what is within it is bizarre. I think it's very authoritarian. It's almost, as if you're sort of in the Catholic Church in the 16th century or something. But I can understand why you might say there shouldn't be debates in CLP meetings, in local parties about the IHRA or whether or not to accept it. I can see why that would be an unstrategic thing to do, or potentially, an ill-advised thing to do. But no one is doing that. Of the motions I've seen in CLPs, people are generally accepting the IHRA recommendations, but saying that they don't want the former leader to have the whip suspended from them when it's unclear why. So instead of her standing up and saying, we shouldn't have members debating whether or not Corbyn should have the whip, which is a much weaker argument, she has to make up that they're doing something that they're not. We also aren't having people debating whether or not anti-Semitism exists in the Labour Party at all. None of the motions I've seen suggest that. There might be one or two people in the hundreds of thousands of members who in a meeting have said something along those lines. But the idea that would lead to thousands and thousands of people being suspended, she is basically implying that thousands and thousands of Labour members are saying stuff in meetings that they're not saying, which, it's the sign of a weak argument, isn't it, when people have to essentially make things up. And I do think there's a moral problem, really, if you're in a leadership position in a political organisation and you make up stuff about the members who work hard for your re-election. Starmer also, for his part, made some interventions which I thought were pretty weak. So these are tweets from Sienna Rogers, who was at the online conference, sort of tweeting some of the main statements. She says, or she tweeted, quoting Keir Starmer, "We're only in this place because of Jeremy's response to the Commission. We've been set back by what Jeremy did in response to the Commission." He adds, "I want to get that focus back on where it needs to be, away from individuals." Now, the reason why I think this is pretty weak is because the reason we are discussing individuals, not the issues, is because he decided to suspend Jeremy Corbyn for saying something which is perfectly within his right to say it was ill-advised and to say, "I'm disappointed Jeremy Corbyn said that." Fine, he can say that. But if you suspend the former leader for saying something which is potentially ill-advised but essentially true, then of course you were going to have a big row about one individual. That's what's happening now. If you stood to unite the party and now you have suspended the previous leader who still has a great amount of support within the party in question, what did you think was going to happen? That is the thing that has made people have what I think is an absolutely necessary debate about the reinstating of Jeremy Corbyn to the Labour whip. So to now stand back and say, "Oh, why are we so obsessed with an individual?" The reason people are obsessed with an individual is because you suspended them on very, very weak pretenses. Ash, I want your thought your thoughts on this, because I mean, some people are saying, we should stop talking so much about Corbyn's suspension and the HRC report. We should talk about policies. But I do think that what we're seeing here is something that can't really be ignored when you've got the deputy leader of the Labour Party saying she will personally expel, or she will, if needs be, expel thousands of members, whilst basically misrepresenting what they are in fact saying and debating. I think that's a serious problem that does need to be resisted.
I mean, Michael, I don't want this to turn into like mutual appreciation society, but I do think that you've consistently been one of the strongest voices on this issue. And I think that one of the things that you said a couple of days ago, I stalk you on social media, just keep an eye on what you're doing, is that you said that Keir Starmer could navigate the situation through honesty. And sometimes that means also telling hard truths. And that is not the strategy that he has taken as a leader. He's looked at what the anti-Semitism issue did to Corbyn's leadership. And I think wherever you are on it, whether you think that there was an endemic problem of anti-Semitism in the party, or whether you think that it was isolated to a few individuals, whether you think there are problems with the processes or not, I think everyone can agree that when those attacks ratcheted up, and you'd listen to the Today programme, and it's like 1, 2, 3 items on Labour anti-Semitism, Jeremy Corbyn hemorrhaged moral credibility in the eyes of the public. And it ended up being very little that he could say or do in terms of reforming the procedures. His office intervened to speed things up. There aren't thou satisfied. Reformed the way in which the disciplinary procedures operated. Well, there aren't thou satisfied. He became the symbol, the totem, the kind of embodiment of what the problem was seen to be. And it meant that when Keir Starmer entered office, he, I think, after spending all that time in the shadow cabinet, was like, well, hang on, there's only one real way to be seen to be strong on this issue. And that means zero tolerance on those who are deemed to be anti-Semitic on the left. And that's not the same as dealing with the problem of anti-Semitism as it exists in society and as it exists within the Labour Party. There's obviously been hugely different ways in which, Labour MPs have been dealt with, from one person using an anti-Semitic trope. I think it was in terms of was it the pieces of silver, or was it shekels, or something like that? It was an anti-Semitic trope to do with, selling out and money in ways which were, the imagery was very much there. Got away with a retraction and an apology, whereas Rebecca Long Bailey was summarily dismissed from the Labour front bench. That's about being reactive and being seen to be harsh on those who are deemed to be the problem. And what that means is that you've closed off all the space to be honest. You've completely boxed yourself in. And what you've said is, for as long as there are certain newspapers, there are certain individuals who write for those newspapers, there are certain aspects of the community leadership say there's a problem with left anti-Semitism, I will show no mercy, give no quarter. There will be no due process for these individuals. The problem for Keir Starmer came when the IHRC report didn't say that. It didn't agree with it. While there was found to be indirect discrimination, and that means, yes, there is an institutional problem within Labour, it didn't lay the sole responsibility at the feet of Jeremy Corbyn. It didn't label him as an anti-Semite and said this man has to be kicked out of the party. And so you back into trying to utilise political means to achieve what is essentially a political goal. You don't have the bureaucracy to hide behind of, well, I'm just implementing the findings of the report. And that's what the situation that Starmer and Rayner have created for themselves. It's a really difficult one, because now they're trying to say, well, in the spirit of the HRC report, we can't have these kinds of discussions about, whether or not it was right to remove the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. The report says nothing like that. The report actually takes quite, pains to say that there are, Article 10 rights to freedom of expression, which includes deviating in opinion on the scale of anti-Semitism, even. And those are things which Starmer and Rayner are completely unable to admit or engage with, because their entire strategy has been, here's the stick, beat us with it until you've had enough of it. And that's not a way to deal with anti-Semitism within the party. That's not a way to deal with views which may be amongst the membership. It's not a way to deal with, and this is a real thing, and I know it because I've felt it at times, a sort of knee-jerk defensive position amongst the left. So I think it's one of those things where everybody loses effectively, apart from the Labour right, because for as long as Keir Starmer is seen to be at the helm of a party which can't keep Jeremy Corbyn out effectively, he too will become subject to some of those attacks, and he too will start to lose some of that moral authority. This is a crisis of his making.
No, I totally agree. And I mean, I think that point about honesty is quite important, because I think there is a way out of this, which involves people being honest about the failings of Corbyn's leadership and the role played by his opponents within the party to sort of try and actively make this problem one, appear bigger than it actually was, but also to make sure that it continued longer than it needed to by, for example, sitting on complaints if they felt that would make Jeremy Corbyn's life more difficult, which I'm pretty confident did happen. That's not just from the Labour leaks, that's also from articles in BuzzFeed by Alex Wickham, people who aren't necessarily allied to the left. This information is out there, but people like The Guardian aren't particularly interested in reporting on it. And I think if Starmer and Angela Rayner had sort of taken a lead on saying, let's be honest about this, I think they could have taken the membership with them. But basically what they've said is, we're creating this massive taboo, which is something that no one is allowed to discuss. And we are going to set the agenda, which is that this was an outright total failure from the leadership. No one else shares any blame. Nothing was ever exaggerated. Nothing was ever weaponized. To even suggest that is a taboo. And they are trying to basically force what no one really believes onto the entire Labour membership and say, to question that makes you problematic, to question that makes you racist. And it's an incredibly unsustainable situation, and I think a fairly toxic situation, because you're telling people, look, one, you can't speak about something that, the position they've landed on is not very sustainable because it's not very convincing. But then two, they're saying, we are going to take very controversial action, for example, taking the whip away from Jeremy Corbyn, but you're not allowed to discuss it for reasons involving racism. And it just so happens that you not discussing it benefits us in our factional endeavours to get rid of the predecessor. So it's all such an awful way of dealing with the painful experiences of the past 4 to 5 years. I think David Renton, who we've had on the show, who wrote an article recently for Novara Media, an equalities lawyer, was very good on this as one of the weaknesses of the HRC report, which is saying this could have been an opportunity to explain what had gone on, to talk about the leadership's failings, to talk about how damaging it was that his factional opponents sat on complaints, etc. But the HRC report, because it didn't sort of bother to distinguish different parts of the party and recognise that this was a deeply factional political organisation, and didn't really bother to mention the fact that claims were exaggerated here and there, partly because that's not the question it's set out to answer, didn't provide the closure it could have done. We're going to go on to another statement from that conference, probably the most memorable one. Before we do that, if you are new to the show, to this channel, do please hit the subscribe button. We want to get up to the next. We want the next 100,000 subscribers now. So hit that subscribe button. We put out content so regularly now. Most days, this show goes live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Let's take a look at another tweet. This again is from Sienna Rogers, who was reporting the event. She tweets, Peter Mandelson says, I'm worried about one thing. That is this recommended approach by the EHRC of an independent process. He says the NEC should take ownership of process, and an independent process can't do that. Hashtag JLM 2020. Now, Gabriel Pogrund, who's a Times journalist, who's been on Aaron's show, he was in conversation with Mandelson when that was said, so he tweets to back up Sienna Rogers. And he says, Peter Mandelson just told me this at Jewish Labour conference. In short, he said, Labour can't allow the left to legalise party management as it did in the 1980s. So EHRC recommendation of an independent disciplinary process cannot stand. So this is amazing. One, I mean, what lots of people are pointing out is that he seems to be disagreeing with the EHRC recommendations. Some people are saying that means he should have to apologise and be suspended. I personally think people need to, people are telling everyone to apologise way too much. You're allowed to disagree with what is in a report. But what is clear here, and what it looks like to me, is, and especially with that reference to the 1980s, is that Peter Mandelson wants there to be a disciplinary process that can be utilised by the leadership to get rid of people from the party who they don't want to be in the party. And an independent process obviously means that you can't be partial in that way. You can't use a disciplinary process. Well, you might be able to, depending on how they draw up the rules. This will be something to look into in the future. But even if you didn't have a totally fair independent disciplinary process, Peter Mandelson wants even more control for the political leadership of the party to determine who can be inside it and outside of it. Now, that would be worrying enough if it wasn't clear that he is willing to utilise the issue of anti-Semitism to get his way in terms of determining who should be in and who should be outside of the party. And his reference to the 80s is important because he's saying that there we had all these lefties who, to make Labour electable, we had to purge from the party, but they were using the legalistic structures of the Labour Party, the rules-based structures of the Labour Party, to not let us have our way. And what our New Labour project was all about was making sure that the leadership had absolute leeway to determine the organisation of the party, the direction of the party as they pleased, in part according to focus groups, to try and make it as electable as possible. Obviously, this ended up with a party leadership that was so detached from the membership, so detached from the population at large, that they ended up with catastrophic decisions such as the Iraq War, not something we necessarily want to return to. But you can see what's motivating him there. He's saying, I don't want a rules-based system, actually. I'm not interested in due process. What I'm interested in is having a leadership who can get their way. And if that means using anti-Semitism to get their way, so be it. I mean, Ash, is there an interpretation of what Peter Mandelson said there, which is sort of more sympathetic to it? Am I being overly harsh?
Oh, I'm sure if you give Alistair Campbell some time, he could come up with one. But
it's a very good comment.
I mean, no, there's not. I think you're completely right in this matter. And in some ways, there's a level of honesty from Peter Mandelson there about what this is about. There was, I think, hope amongst the Labour right that the IHRA report be more amenable to being wielded in a brutally factional manner. That it would say the problem is Jeremy Corbyn, the problem was Seamus Milne, the problem was Carrie Murphy, and these are people who have to be drummed out of legitimate politics. Otherwise, you've tarnished the Labour Party's reputation with racism indelibly. Now, I personally don't think that the IHRC's report was perfect. I think that there were some areas where things didn't add up, and one of the things was thinking that all forms of political intervention were inappropriate and meant that there were institutionally anti-Semitic outcomes, even if those interventions were to speed things up. That's one area where I'd go, yes, I am critical of the IHRC's report, because that doesn't make sense to me. If you are a political organ of a party and your bureaucratic wing isn't operating fast enough to achieve outcomes in the interests of anti-racism, I don't understand how it's institutionally racist to intervene to try and speed that up. You might say, well, that signals a weakness in bureaucratic integrity, but I don't understand how that creates an institutionally racist outcome. So that's one area where I go, I don't think that the IHRC report is beyond reproach. However, I think generally thorough, generally fair, even if there are these bits which to me didn't make sense, or there are these bits, as David Renton highlighted, where there are some real missed opportunities. And so what Peter Mandelson, I think, is speaking out loud, and speaking out loud very honestly, which is, well, just because the IHRC report has come out, has made some recommendations, which are legally binding, by the way, that doesn't mean that the factional war is over. And it won't be over until the left are essentially ensealed, put in a tomb, buried at the bottom of, the deepest trench of the Atlantic Ocean. And it starts with Jeremy Corbyn, who is a totem, not just for a set of economic policies, but also for party democracy, which ultimately, he and his leadership weren't brave enough to take all the way. And I think that was one of the other things which mortally wounded him. He didn't empower the grassroots enough to essentially keep the PLP in line and stop some of the really, backbitey, hostile briefing behavior, which really hamstrung his leadership. But yeah, Mandelson's honest about what this is all about. And what ultimately it does is that I think it discredits a very real issue, and the very real issue is about institutional racism within the Labour Party. Its processes not having been fit for purpose. I know that there are other people on the left who disagreed with me about the NEC being an appropriate disciplinary body. I've personally never felt comfortable with it, not just to do with the issue of racism, not just to do with the issue of anti-Semitism, but in particular workplace bullying and sexual harassment. I don't think that it's right that you can have someone deciding on a disciplinary process who might be mates with that person. That's just always been my point of view. There's also, I think, really serious questions about what the anti-Semitism crisis has done in terms of really creating, I think, a break. It's really contributed to a breakdown of trust between different identity groups. And I think that there's an issue with how Keir Starmer has chosen to handle this, which is rather than saying that we do anti-racism best when we all come around the table, we have an honest discussion about what's going on and we work out a fair settlement. He's essentially turned around and Angela Rayner has backed it up with her statement about, thousands of expulsions if necessary, that, there will be one identity group will have effectively a power of veto over the functioning of aspects of the Labour Party's, political orientation, and other identity groups, whether that's Muslims, whether that's Black people, whether that's the GRT community, won't have that. And what that means is that instead of having a shared anti-racist movement just when you need it the most, when you have this violent revival of anti-Semitism, when you've got horrendous anti-Blackness, which results in deportations, the Windrush scandal, deaths in police custody, as well as street racism, when you've got rampant Islamophobia up and down the country, the actions of the Labour Party, the actions of Keir Starmer's leadership are really inhibiting any sort of shared coordination between different identity groups, because he's decided to deal with one crisis by going, I will treat one group differently from everybody else. And I think that that's not how you do anti-racism. I don't want Muslims, by the way, to have an effective power of veto over the political orientation of the Labour Party. I want us to be taken seriously, to have our equal rights, to be able to coordinate, articulate a position, which we then hash out with everybody else. And I want the same, for racialized minorities, whether those are religious minorities or ethnic ones.
I think all of those points are so important, and it kind of does link actually to one other thing I want to bring up, which is also a development from the weekend, which is on Sunday, which just so happened to be the UN Day for solidarity with Palestinians. A letter was published in The Guardian from 122 Palestinian and Arab academics, journalists and intellectuals expressing their concerns about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which the government is currently pressuring universities to adopt. And why I think this is relevant in this moment is because, as I've said, I think the only way we can really move on from this crisis in the Labour Party is with honesty. And I really do think that an area where people on the left, right and centre of the party have not been honest, this is not everyone, but I know of people on the left, right and centre of the party who have not been honest about this, is on the fact that the Labour Party, by using arguments where people were using arguments say you have to let people define their own oppression, you have to let people define the discrimination that they are subject to, adopted a definition of anti-Semitism which popular opinion among Palestinians thinks is racist towards them. So you've said you have to let people define their own oppression. Now you've got popular opinion in Palestine saying, look, if you pass this particular document which says that for us to call Israel a racist endeavour is racist, or for us to say that the right to Jewish self-determination, as in the state of Israel, is ethnically exclusionary to us and therefore we cannot support it, they were systematically ignored. And it's not just the Labour Party here, because I don't really want to rehash the debate about whether or not it should have been adopted. There was enormous pressure which the Labour Party were under. So I'm not interested in judging who on the NEC voted either way. But what I do think is absolutely outrageous is, one, the media coverage of this. So if you think about how BBC political editors, if you think about how The Guardian reported this, all they ever said was, why is Corbyn ignoring this oppressed group who want to define their own oppression? And never did they say, look, maybe what the Labour Party are trying to do here is completely reasonable. You have one group who have put forward one definition, of oppression, which in this case was the Jewish communal organisations in this country who were saying we want the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to be written into Labour's rule book. You had another community, also incredibly oppressed, who were the Palestinian community, who were saying, no, we think this document is incredibly dangerous to our rights, to our ability to speak about our own oppression, to our ability to campaign for our own liberation. And what the Labour Party did, very reasonably, was to say, look, let's listen to both of these groups and try and come up with some sort of compromise. The compromise they came up with was something which looked a lot like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. In fact, they took that definition, but they changed some of the examples to make sure that people could still advocate for Palestine without being put under a cloud of suspicion that they were themselves racist just for advocating for a subjugated group. Now, that's what the Labour Party did in that situation. And what did you hear from The Guardian? What did you hear from the BBC? We cannot possibly comprehend what is going on. Why are they starting this unnecessary fight? Why would you possibly, in this situation, not immediately concede to the requests of one group? And never did they question that there was, or even bother to familiarize themselves with the fact that there was another community, another oppressed group who was saying, we don't want this to happen. And the reason Palestinians were ignored in that debate is because they don't have much influence in British public life. There aren't that many Palestinians in this country, and the Palestinians who live in Palestine don't have that much influence in British public life. So even though you had a community which is very, very united in its opposition to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, that could just be completely ignored, and everyone has forgotten about it. It's like it didn't happen. And you have all of these liberals saying, look, what we have to do is make sure that we have the confidence of communities. The Labour Party does not have the confidence of the Palestinian community. It doesn't right now. That's evident in these open letters with many independent and prestigious academics, journalists and intellectuals saying they oppose a definition of anti-Semitism which the Labour Party has just adopted. But it doesn't matter. And there are so many liberals in this country who just don't care, because it's convenient to ignore these people, so they're willing to do it. And I think for us to have honesty about this debate, we do have to recognize that Palestinians were thrown under a bus, and they were thrown under a bus because it was convenient to do, and we have an entire liberal class in this country who is willing to ignore that because they can, because it doesn't serve any purposes of attacking or making a left-wing leader seem odd and confusing. Why would they? If you think of the debate about the IHRA, all of it was about IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's all saying, this is so confusing. Why would he possibly be resisting this? It's so unfathomable. There was such a simple explanation for anyone who was willing to listen, and they weren't. And I do think that demands honesty, that demands a reckoning, and that tells us a great deal about the anti-racist credentials of so many liberals in this country. We have a bit of a breaking story we're going to go to, which is from The Guardian. It's sort of relevant to this story about Labour whipping to vote for the Tory Brexit deal. There was a quote, I'm not sure if I read it out in that article, but it was from a frontbencher who was saying, look, if you want something to happen, vote for it. That's politics, baby. Now, Labour, it seems, are not listening to their own advice, or not listening to the advice of that shadow frontbencher when it comes to the COVID tiers. So this is breaking news via The Guardian. Labour to abstain in vote on COVID tiers as Tories threaten to rebel. And they write, the Prime Minister is set to announce new one-off discretionary funding paid to councils for wet pubs and bars which cannot open under the strictest new tiers restrictions for England, The Guardian understands. But Labour is understood to believe that support for the hospitality sector must go further and will abstain on Tuesday's Commons vote on the tiers system, which is due to replace lockdown rules from Wednesday and put 99% of the country into tiers 2 and 3. The vote is still expected to pass. Actually, I sit on the fence on this one. This is kind of like the Andy Burnham move. So I think it makes some sense. They're basically saying, look, of course we back greater restrictions, but we are going to use the leverage we have to make sure that you give greater support to those economic institutions which you are not currently providing the necessary support. So it does seem like maybe here they've learned from Andy Burnham and are trying to use a bit of leverage. Ash, do you want to comment on this breaking story before I go to our final shout-outs? We've got a lot of birthdays to go through.
Yeah. I mean, very quickly, I actually think that this is a smart move. I actually think this is a smart move from Keir Starmer. I do want someone to make, like the meme where you make someone have like laser red eyes. I want someone to do that for Keir Starmer. It's just like abstain, because that is his like one parliamentary superpower. But I think in this case, he's correct too. Labour wouldn't actually be able to significantly change the fate of this bill to either inflict a defeat or anything else. That's pretty much within the Conservatives' hands. And they have this position of, we advocate for greater restrictions. We also want, fairer financial support packages for the hospitality sector, but that's going to get lost in the noise. By abstaining strategically here, withdrawing from the debate, what that does is that it puts more pressure on the Conservatives and their own internal divisions over this particular matter. So I think this is an example of a tactical retreat from the field in order to let the others fight amongst themselves. I don't think that's the case for every single abstention that Keir Starmer has whipped for, particularly with the Overseas Operations Bill, with the Human Intelligence Bill as well. But I think this is one case where it's perhaps the wise thing to do. Can I just very quickly say something on the issue of IHRA, the IHRA definition? There's a wealth of legal opinion out there, if anyone cared to look at it, outlining the risks posed by IHRA in terms of clamping down on legitimate, protected freedom of speech. And one of the people who spoke out against the way it's been used on, in particular, US campuses, was the person who drafted the definition, which was then taken up and used and became the IHRA definition. There's also, Jeffrey Robertson, QC. There's a wealth of legal opinion out there. It's a live debate. It's a legitimate debate, and not everyone who takes part in it is an anti-Semite hiding in the cupboard, a bad faith actor, someone who's disguising their real opinions in order to advocate for the cause of racism. And what irritates me to the high heavens is that wealth of legal opinion on freedom of speech grounds was never really engaged with. It was never really engaged with. There was a kind of lazy instinct of, well, you wouldn't tell any other minority group they couldn't define their own oppression. Well, actually, that happens all the time. It's very rare that a minority group does get to define their own oppression in such a way which affects the freedom of expression of other people. It's very rare that that thing is able to happen. And in particular, with this definition, where there are lines being taken on an active geopolitical conflict, where the legitimacy of both actors is constantly being negotiated, contested, renegotiated, it's a very serious thing to say that it is always a racist thing to say one of these things. And that's not a marginal opinion. That's not an insane opinion to hold. Like I said, there's a wealth of legal, opinion out there to back it up, including one of the original drafters of the definition. But also, this was a position taken by Chuka Ramuna just a few years ago when the IHRA definition was going through a Common Select Committee. And he said, well, look, hang on, there's a problem with some of these examples. I wouldn't recommend adopting all of them because there are real freedom of expression issues here. But that aspect of it, the fact that IHRA has had a kind of journey through British political institutions before the Labour anti-Semitism crisis, was forgotten, tossed out of a window because it didn't fit a very binary discussion. I also know, just very, very quickly, I know you want to move on to the birthday shout-outs, and God knows I want to too. But very, very quickly, after IHRA was adopted, Labour also adopted the APPG definition of Islamophobia. And my opinion on this got much less backlash than my opinion on IHRA did, but I was also against the adoption of the APPG definition. I don't think that the solution to one bad definition of racism is to have more bad definitions of racism. And the problem is that both definitions try and do something which I think is wrong, which is they behave as though the speech acts which take place within a political membership body are separate and distinct from the policy orientation of that political party. I think there's less of that illusion with the IHRA definition because the examples, so many of them do concern Israel and Palestine, but the APPG group definition of Islamophobia is pretty much, be nice to Muslims if you can. But there's really no sense of what that means in terms of policy. The fact that, there are still so many people who are members of the Labour Party who voted in favour of the Iraq War and strongly advocated in favour of it. I don't really care if someone says a racist word to me in the Labour Party, when I think that the fact that so many people who gladly participated in a disastrous invasion which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians can comfortably enjoy a role in public life and claim to be a Labour Party member, that is the greater indictment of the Labour Party's race politics. And as long as we play this game, and when I say we, I'm talking about identity groups who have felt frustrated with the way in which the anti-Semitism crisis has sort of corroded the shared terrain of anti-racism. There's this temptation to go, well, you know what, a good result would be if we could take up the same space. No, that wouldn't be a good result. It wouldn't be a good result because we wouldn't actually be looking at what it would mean for the Labour Party to be a genuinely anti-racist organisation. And it's not just about interpersonal conduct and how people treat each other. It's not just about how many definitions you've got. It's about the policy direction. And I think we've lost sight of that. Sorry, that was a very rambling comment from one thing to another, but I had strong opinions, Michael.
No, I mean, it was very well put. I wouldn't say that was rambling at all. I'd say that was comprehensive, is how I'm going to phrase that instead. Humdinger with a tenner. What would it take to bring in primarying in the US, the primarying system they have in the US to the Labour Party? It would take a rule change at conference, which I think would be very, very difficult to pass without the backing of the Labour leadership. So I think that's probably going to be one for the next time, and we have a lefty in power. That was obviously one of the big missed opportunities of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. I think we should still be campaigning for it in the meantime, but I think the chances of passing that while Keir Starmer's leader is very low, unfortunately. Now for the birthdays. I'm going to start bringing beers so I can just crack them open at the end. David Bradford with a £5. Can I get a shout out for my twin brother Carl? It's our birthday. Also, happy birthday, Carl and David. We both follow Novara for the top quality reporting. And Lauren Murphy with 17.89 in the super chat. Hey, Michael, can you wish my boyfriend Joe a happy 30th for today? He's a cracking socialist, and Fox's thing went over my sentence again. And we're big fans of Novara Media. Thanks for all the work you do, guys. We do tell everyone about the show. That's all we ask of you guys. Tell everyone about the show. We're pretty happy with the way Joe. And happy birthday, Joe. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I nearly forgot the core point of the comment there.
Yeah, come on, Michael.
I got too distracted by people telling other people about the show, which is obviously it's one of my obsessions. K-Dot with £3. Big up Ash, Michael, Angry Aaron, and Novara. Thank you very much, K-Dot. He's very gentle, really. Ash Sarkar, it's been a pleasure as always.
This is the best part of my week, and I've had you 2 nights in a row as well. And all that talk of anal depositories, I'll be riding high off that.
It turns out a depository. If you look on Urban Dictionary, which I did throughout the well, I won't explain it. You can look it up on Urban Dictionary if you want.
Okay, you can WhatsApp me that. That's
I'm not
definitely.
into it,
I mean, we're not regulated by Ofcom, but
it's not my vibe. You're going to be back tomorrow night. Do you want to plug your interview for tomorrow? Because I overheard it today and it sounded really cool.
Oh my God, I do. So I interviewed former police superintendent Leroy Logan today. And for those of you who've been watching the Small Axe series on the BBC, he was played by John Boyega in the latest episode, Red, White and Blue. He's a really, really interesting guy. We obviously have different politics, but I sort of shared my misgivings about, better representation equaling less racist policing. He challenged some of my preconceptions too. We talked about the decriminalization of drugs. We talked about defund the police. And we also talked about the upcoming North London derby, because as well as him being a former copper, he is a current gooner. So you've got all that to look forward to. You should tune in to Novara Media's YouTube at 7 p.m. tomorrow, and it will be beamed directly into your frontal lobe.
So you know what to do. Tomorrow at 7 p.m, you're tuning in to Ash with the big interview. We do big interviews every Tuesday at 7 p.m. I'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. for another episode of Tysky Sour with Aaron Bastani. This time around, Ash, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for watching and for your super chats and for your general support. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.